Hello there, my name is Christopher Pryor and I'm a lecturer in Imperial History at the University of Leeds, and I'm here today to talk about decolonisation, the end of the British Empire after the Second World War. And the focus for today's talk will be the question, how important was Indian independence in 1947 in changing British attitudes to decolonisation during the period from 1945 to 1960. It's going to be a very simple structure today. What I'm going to start with is arguing from the viewpoint that yes, the events of 1947 were important in changing British attitudes. Then I'm going to look from the other point of view, that 1947 wasn't a turning point, and I'm going to do this in two ways. Firstly, I'll suggest that there were other events that were more important in changing British attitudes during this 15-year period. And secondly, I'll question the extent to which the British actually wholly changed their attitudes. So three things. Firstly, arguing yes, the events of 1947 were important, then challenging this in two separate ways. The British politicians of the post-war period like to emphasise in public that the attainment by colonies of independence away from the British Empire was part of a grand British scheme. Most of the newspapers of the period, such as the Times, put forward this idea in their editorials. They argued that what was happening with India and other places was exactly the same as what happened in New Zealand, Canada, and other places such as that from the middle of the 19th century onwards. While some genuinely thought that this had been the aim of the British all along, this claim about a grand British project was mainly stressed by politicians and journalists as a means of avoiding embarrassment, a way of avoiding Britain losing face. By emphasising Britain's supposed benevolence, it was thought it would be possible to make the end of empire seem a source of altruistic strength rather than national weakness. However, the extent to which this propaganda worked and convinced the British public is limited. If you look at a lot of the imperial culture of the time, for instance a film like Black Narcissus of 1947, you get a sense that the British were registering a sense of imperial crisis, that the British could no longer go about doing what they wanted in India anymore. This type of depiction of India is very different to that which went onto the silver screen in the 1930s. Films like The Drum or Gunga Din, they'd been far more uncritical in their belief that the British were always able to win out over their enemies and difficulties out in the empire. With these works of the 30s, the British were always victorious. They were always manned. The empire was always manned by decent, stiff upper-lipped types who always knew what was best. So any difficulties they came across were temporary. But in these new works of the 40s, there was instead sometimes defeat. I'm sorry to give you the ending of the film away in case you do end up watching it, but for instance, at the end of Black Narcissus, the idealism of a group of nuns is defeated. The Indian landscape, or the Indian people end up defeating them. And of course, India was known as the jewel in the crown, the glitz and the glamour of the empire, the land that fired up the imaginations of Kipling and the countless children and adults who read his work. So the independence of India was a shock to the British public because it represented the end of a particular view of empire. The view that the empire was something gloriously romantic and timeless. The extent to which the loss of India was felt by the British can be measured by the amount that was written about this compared to the end of empire elsewhere. Works like Staying On by Paul Scott, produced in the 1970s, were still, despite the fact that this is 30 years after independence, they were still filled with a sense of sadness and nostalgia for the disappearance of a past world. There was no real equivalent to this sort of thing when it came to Nigeria or to the Sudan, for example.